Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 12, 2025, with my latest rant of the week. The subject of my rant this week is going to be Kabuki theater. Now, for those of you who've been following my commentary on this heinous genocide in Gaza that's been going on for about 19 months now, you'll be familiar with my use of that phrase. Basically, what I mean by Kabuki theater is the elaborate spectacle that the Biden administration engaged in during the time that Israel was committing genocide on its watch. In that spectacle, Biden and his underlings, like Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, purported to be concerned about the conditions in Gaza, purported to want Israel to provide sufficient humanitarian aid, and to engage in some kind of a ceasefire that would secure the release of the hostages and at least minimize the killing, if not bring it to an end altogether. But in fact, the Biden administration was simply pretending to be seeking all of those things. That was my position. And in fact, we ultimately received confirmation of this when former Israeli ambassador Michael Herzog made a startling admission recently. And what he said was, quote, "God did the state of Israel a favor that Biden was the president during this period. We fought in Gaza for over a year, and the administration never came to us and said, ceasefire now." It never did, and that's not to be taken for granted. Now, folks, if that doesn't prove that the Biden administration was engaged in Kabuki theater, I don't know what does. But here's the particularly maddening thing about all of this. That Kabuki theater did not begin with Joe Biden. It has been going on for decades. I go back all the way to the administration of the elder Bush in the period around 1990. The Bush administration at that time was purported to be frustrated and deeply chagrined by the Israeli government's refusal to cease settlement expansion in the West Bank. But despite its purported frustration, it did absolutely nothing of any efficacy in order to bring the settlement expansion to an end. The most obvious option available to it being a suspension or outright termination of the provision of military aid to Israel. It simply refused to use its leverage to achieve what it purportedly wanted, which was no more settlements in the occupied West Bank. Then came Bill Clinton. We heard the same rancid bullshit line from the Clinton administration as well. Again and again, we were told how frustrated he was with settlement expansion, but he did absolutely nothing to bring it to an end, even though the tools for him to secure that objective were readily available to him, primarily a suspension or termination of military aid to Israel. Then we get the administration of the younger Bush, otherwise affectionately known as W. W was purported to be furious with the Israeli government when it compared the Bush administration's supposed opposition to settlement expansion to Nazi appeasement. Did the Bush administration do anything to actually effect a termination of settlement expansion and ensure the realization of this supposed dream of the two-state solution that U.S. leaders have claimed to have been seeking for decades? No, it did nothing of any substance. It did not pull the plug, not even a suspension of military aid to Israel. Then we get Obama. And there probably were real tensions between Netanyahu and Obama, particularly around the subject of the nuclear negotiations with Iran, resulting in the JCPOA, and which allowed Iran to engage in very limited forms of uranium enrichment for a period of 12 years, after which it would be free to engage in uranium enrichment without restriction, but subject to its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, so that was real tension, of course. But at the end of the day, even though Obama didn't particularly seem to like Netanyahu, and even though they had a tussle over the whole question of the Iran nuclear deal, Obama never did anything to actually force Netanyahu to stop attacking Iran or to end settlement expansion within the West Bank. On the contrary, just as he was heading out the door, Barack Obama entered into the richest military aid package for Israel in U.S. history, $3.8 billion a year over the period of a decade. Now, some will point out that just before he ended his second term, Obama instructed his officials at the United Nations not to veto a resolution, a UN Security Council resolution, which condemned Israel's settlements. He didn't vote in favor of it. He simply refrained from vetoing it. But this was not the first time that the UN Security Council had adopted such a resolution. In fact, both it and the General Assembly had adopted many resolutions over decades condemning Israel's settlements in the West Bank as a violation of international law, and also condemning its annexation of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and its annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights. But nothing came of any of that because the United States ensured that none of these resolutions was enforced. And so too was that the case in respect of the resolution adopted in 2016, just before the departure of Obama from the White House. It effectively was a toothless resolution that accomplished nothing. At the end of the day, Barack Obama did exactly what Israel wanted. He continued to supply weapons despite its flagrant and innumerable violations of international law. So this whole notion of the U.S.-Israeli Kabuki theater is one of long vintage. And this brings me now to the second Trump administration. We've been hearing more and more over the past several weeks of the Trump administration's supposed frustration with and disappointment in Benjamin Netanyahu. And it all got off on a sour note, one might argue, when Trump, just before returning to the White House in January of this year, shared a tweet from Professor Jeffrey Sachs in which Jeffrey Sachs described Benjamin Netanyahu with complete justification as a deep, dark son of a bitch. And of course, there was a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, but we soon came to understand that the Trump administration had absolutely no interest in trying to rein in America's rabid Israeli attack dog. It began to deliver 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs to Netanyahu. It allowed Netanyahu to treat the ceasefire agreement like toilet paper, sending its forces into Rafah, refusing to evacuate its forces from Rafah as it had agreed to do, and resuming the relentless bombing of Palestinians and the destruction of the civilian infrastructure and even the outright starvation of the civilian population. All of that resumed under Donald Trump, and he just kept pumping more and more weapons into the genocidal entity. But now we're hearing things like Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, has been effectively fired. He's being moved off into a much less important role at the United Nations. And there's a lot of speculation that the reason for this is because Waltz was conspiring behind Donald Trump's back to ensure that the Trump administration pursued Israel's agenda. Now, there's been no official confirmation of that, and as far as I can tell, that is sheer speculation. But whatever the reasons may be for the dismissal of Michael Waltz, there are some other things that are going on which people are arguing is indicative of a rupture between the Trump administration and the regime of the suicidally psychotic war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu. For one thing, the Trump administration came to an agreement to stop bombing Ansar Allah and Yemen in exchange for Ansar Allah's commitment not to attack U.S. shipping. And what is notable about this is that the agreement apparently did not forbid Ansar Allah from attacking Israel itself, and it has continued to do that since the agreement was entered into. So many are arguing that this is a very significant piece of evidence of a rupture between the Trump administration and the Israeli regime. There's also the fact that Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense, I should say, just canceled a previously scheduled trip to Israel. At the same time, tomorrow, May 13th, Donald Trump is scheduled to arrive in Saudi Arabia, where he's going to hold talks with the Saudis that will not include, at least not directly, any representatives of the Israeli government. And there are reports that the Saudis have requested that representatives of the governments of Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinian Authority be included in those talks and will be included in those talks. And there's speculation that the Trump administration is willing to do some kind of a deal with the Saudis that will be of significant benefit to the United States and that will not ensure Saudi normalization with Israel absent a concrete commitment to the two-state solution on the behalf of the genocidal entity, which is something, of course, that's never going to happen. So I've seen a lot of people arguing particularly in the alternative media, that this is indicative of a rupture between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu regime. But I have to tell you, folks, at the end of the day, the one thing that matters the most, and really the only thing that matters in assessing the state of U.S.-Israeli relations, is the fact that the United States continues to supply the weapons to Israel that it is employing not only to commit genocide against the Palestinian people, but to engage in heinous acts of aggression against Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and others. So what are we to make of all of this? Well, one school of thought is that the frustration and the sometimes outright anger on the part of various U.S. administrations over the decades is genuine. It's very real. But that at the end of the day, one U.S. president after another was unable to do what he believed was in the interests of the United States because of the power of the Israel lobby. And of course, the most prominent proponents of this interpretation of the historical record are John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt, who've written a seminal work on the power of the Israel lobby in the United States. On the other side of this debate, you have people like former U.S. Secretary of State Chief of Staff, Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who say that in fact the Israel government does exactly what the United States government wants it to do and is in effect America's rabid attack dog in the region. As many of you will know, I am definitely in the Lawrence Wilkerson camp on this particular issue. I would point out that the power of the lobby, at least in an economic sense, which is really what matters, it is after all about the bucks, is not particularly great relative to other lobbying organizations in the United States. Just take a look at this list of the top 20 lobbying groups by expenditure in 2025. You'll see that AIPAC, the principal Zionist lobbying organization in the United States, about which so much is said, doesn't appear anywhere on that list. There are many more lobbying organizations and interests that have far more economic clout than does AIPAC. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that the most powerful lobby group in the United States is what we collectively refer to as the military-industrial complex, which benefits enormously and in fact depends for its very existence upon wars. And what country on God's green earth today is more responsible for war, for destruction, for the consumption of military goods than Israel? Israel not only starts and provokes and perpetuates wars and has been doing this for decades, but it convinces the Americans to get involved in massively destructive wars in order to pursue or advance an agenda that is favored by the government of Israel. For example, George W. Bush's criminal invasion of Iraq. So if you ask me, the military-industrial complex is likely to be exercising a far greater degree of control over U.S. policy in West Asia than AIPAC and all the other Zionist lobby groups put together ever could. So my interpretation, which I will defend until the cows come home and until somebody shows me evidence to the contrary, is that the reason why the U.S. Government consistently engages in this Kabuki theater is because it doesn't want to be blamed for the heinous crimes of Israel. By going to the press, oftentimes through anonymous sources, and leaking that the U.S. administration of the day is frustrated in or disappointed with or furious with the Israeli government, American presidents and their inner circle put distance between themselves and the crimes of Israel. And they'll trot out this narrative that, well, Israel lives in a very tough neighborhood and its whole reason for existence is to provide a sanctuary for the Israeli people, and the Holocaust, one of the greatest monstrosities committed in human history against a marginalized people. All of these things are justifications for U.S. support for Israel, notwithstanding its unsavory tactics, and we don't like it, and we wish Israel didn't behave this way, but at the end of the day, we're going to support Israel anyways because that's just the right thing to do, and it's necessary for the survival of this sanctuary for the Jewish people that's been set up on the land that God promised to the people of Zion. That's the narrative. It is all just designed to exonerate to some degree U.S. administrations for the ultimate responsibility for Israel's crimes. At the end of the day, my friends, all that matters is that the United States government, and this is true of the Trump administration, continues to provide the weapons to Israel with which it is blowing apart Palestinian children before the eyes of the world. And as long as it continues to supply those weapons, not to mention plenty of other economic aid, not to mention political cover, not to mention protection from prosecution for war crimes by international tribunals, then all the rest of this is just noise. All the claims that the Trump administration is angry, that it's frustrated, that there's a rupture, it's just noise. Now, I don't want you to interpret my commentary, my skepticism about the U.S. government's willingness to rein in its rabid Israeli attack dog as a pessimistic outlook for the Palestinian people. In fact, despite my horror, one which I'm sure you share, at what is being done to the Palestinian people, I believe that victory is at hand. But the victory will not come about as a result of the U.S. government's sudden determination to do the right thing. No, it's going to come from the Palestinian people themselves and from the resistance groups in West Asia that are supporting them, principally Ansar Allah, and from the pressure being applied on Western governments and international institutions by people of conscience around the world. The Israeli entity is becoming exhausted. Its military is almost in open revolt. In the last 3 weeks, there have been 4 or 5 officers of the Israeli military who have been killed in Gaza. Many others have been wounded, and that's just what the Israeli government is admitting to. Over 100,000 reservists are refusing to show up for duty. Israeli soldiers are signing, pilots are signing petitions calling for an end to the war. There are hostages who are putting out videos from the dungeons of Gaza, excoriating the Israeli government for continuing these wars. The protests are getting larger and larger. The economy of Israel is buckling. The state of Israel has been completely delegitimized in the eyes of billions of people across the world, including in the West. The days of the genocidal entity are numbered, my friends, and its demise is at hand. The liberation of the Palestinian people will happen within our lifetimes, but it won't be because any United States president has the conscience necessary to bring it to an end. Now, before I sign off from my latest rant of the week, I just want to update you on the challenge that I issued to 25 prominent Zionist lawyers last month to debate me on the issue of whether Israel is committing genocide. As yet, I have not had a single acceptance of that challenge from any one of these prominent, well-heeled, and highly experienced advocates. And as I've said before, I'm going to repeat it now. I don't believe that this has anything to do with my superior debating ability. They are every bit as capable, hell, maybe even more capable than I am of debating a position. The reason why they won't accept my debate, folks, is because they know that the evidence against Israel is so overwhelming that even an inexperienced law student could kick their ass in a debate over the question of whether Israel is committing genocide. That is why none of them has taken up this challenge. But if one of them eventually summons the courage to debate me in circumstances where they are doomed to lose because of the monumental evidence of Israel's genocide, I'll certainly let you know, and I'll be very happy that someone has finally accepted that challenge. For now, this is Dimitri Lascaris signing off from Kalamata, Greece on May 12th, 2025.